What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hidden Forces with me, Demetri Kofinas. Today, we speak with Robert Johnson. Robert serves as president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and is a senior fellow and director of the Global Finance Project for the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute in New York. Johnson served for many years as a managing director at Soros Fund Management and was part of the famous team of speculators that broke the Bank of England in 1992, forcing the pound out of ERM. He served as Chief Economist of the U.S. Senate Banking Committee under the leadership of William Proxmire, and before this, as Senior Economist of the U.S. Senate Budget Committee under the leadership of Pete Domenici. Robert was also an executive producer of the Oscar-winning documentary Taxi to the Dark Side, and is the former president of the National Scholastic Chess Foundation. Johnson received a Ph.D. and Master's in Economics from Princeton University and a Bachelor's in both Electrical Engineering and Economics from MIT. In this episode, we explore the history of finance, the politics of economy, and the science of policy. We begin at MIT under the tutelage of Charles Kindleberger, perhaps the greatest financial historian of our time. We learn about Thomas Ferguson's investment theory of party competition and how power and money make policy and drive politics. We take a ride through the Reagan Revolution, the deregulation of financial markets, and stop to contemplate the ways in which markets and the economy have changed in the years after the fall of communism and the rise of globalization in the wake of the Washington Consensus. We hear tales of the early days of high finance, where Robert Johnson, George Soros, and Stanley Druckenmiller shorted sterling, broke the Bank of England, and walked away with a $2 billion payday. That was almost 25 years ago to the day. How has global finance, international trade, foreign exchange, and financial deregulation changed the landscape of speculation in the years since? How has a decline in productivity, a collapse in marginal costs, a rise in total debt, and an aging demographic laid the groundwork for a rise in populism and a decline in the authority of experts? How do we defend our liberal democratic institutions absent convincing academics, trustworthy politicians, and inspirational leaders? How do we get the money out of politics when politics is so beholden to money? How do we reform a corrupted government that is in bed with Wall Street, beholden to multinational corporations, and commingled with industrial military companies whose very profitability is dependent on multi-billion-dollar federal contracts? It's time for people like us to become educated on the hows and the whys of our political economy, because if we don't have the knowledge to call out the experts, then we are powerless to effect the very changes we seek to induce. As always, you can gain access to reading lists put together by me ahead of every episode by visiting the show's website at hiddenforcespod.com. Lastly, if you are listening to the show on iTunes or Android, make sure to subscribe. If you like the show, write us a review. And if you want a sneak peek into how the sausage is made, or for special storylines told through pictures and questions, then like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod. And now, let's get right into this week's conversation. So, Mr. Johnson, welcome to Hidden Forces.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited to speak with you. We spoke a little bit there, and I told you I didn't want us to get too much into all the details because then I'd lose the excitement of asking you for the first time, but I'm very excited to have you on here. Let's start off a little bit with, I don't ever normally do this with guests, but I think your life is particularly interesting and worth exploring a bit. Could you tell me a little bit about where you came from and how you sort of found yourself in this place in your life?
Sure. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and father was a physician and a jazz pianist. My mother was a choral singer and philanthropic, helping the symphony raise money. And it was a turbulent time. We went through the 67 riots. You're just about to see this new movie, Detroit, which is all about that.
When is that coming out?
August 4th, I believe. And it's from the people that made the Hurt Locker, and
oh wow,
how they say, and that was my Hurt Locker.
You were involved in Taxi to the Dark Side. You were the EP on that, right?
I was the executive producer on that film.
Interesting. We should get into that too.
But growing up in Detroit, what I experienced was people explaining Detroit except it didn't explain Detroit. I was watching my father's friends become alcoholics, get despondent or whatever, and America is hearing a different story, which is corrupt African-American public administration, everybody's lost their mojo, etc. And so what felt like to me was they weren't trying to explain what was happening. They were trying to alleviate the anxiety of people whose faith in the American dream was shaken by what happened to Detroit. They were putting on an anesthetic, but it was very cruel to the people where I work up, and it made me a big skeptic about social science. Then I go study economics at MIT eventually and at Princeton, and while I'm doing those things, people are talking about equilibrium. Well, that feels to me like a Disney movie. Like we got a happy ending. We presuppose a happy ending, and then we work towards how we get there.
You were doing your bachelor's in economics at Princeton?
No, bachelor's in economics at MIT, along with a bachelor's in engineering, and then later on a Ph.D. in economics at Princeton.
Okay, so you grew up in Detroit. What kind of physician was your father?
He was a urologist.
Okay, my father was also a physician. And that's fascinating. So you grew up during a very turbulent time, at a time of a great deal of change and economic uncertainty and of course, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and RFK. That was obviously very significant. What you're saying is that your experience of the riots, Detroit, that entire period differed greatly from the way in which the American people experienced it and understood it through the medium of television.
That's correct.
And nightly news. So what prompted you to go to MIT? First of all, it's a great school. I mean, like, what was that decision based on?
That was very simple. For a lot of my life as a youngster, I was a very, very, committed and devoted racing sailor. I like shooting for the Olympic trials. I was a bowman on a boat that won the Canada's Cup, which is in between America's Cups, in 1975. And I wanted to be a naval architect, and the greatest naval architect of the 20th century was a man named Olin Stevens. He had gone to MIT. And while I was on that Canada's Cup boat, an Australian named John Bertrand, who later won the America's Cup away from America in 1983, but in 75, he said, I did my master's at MIT, that's where you should go. So being at MIT felt like that's where a guy with kind of nautical ambition should be.
So you went in what year to MIT?
75.
And
76.
You went with the intention of studying engineering?
I started to study engineering. I was kind of conflicted at the beginning between aeronautical engineering, oceanography, and what they called ocean engineering, naval architecture. I didn't have to declare a major at that time.
But you were introduced to economics somehow. How did that happen?
I took an elective course.
What year? Second year?
About 77 it was.
So as a junior.
With Charles Kindleberger. Theory of international trade. Obviously a guy from Detroit. There was a woman named Emma Rothschild at MIT in political science. She's now at Harvard. And she taught a course on the decline of the American auto industry. So I went and kind of shopped around these things.
Wow, very exciting.
I started talking with Kindleberger about sailing. And he said to me, well, when you write your junior paper, I know a lot about international trade. I know about the competition between the Dutch Empire and the British Empire. But what you know about is nautical technology. And I'm sure their naval strategies and their ship designs and everything were very different. So I can get you the data and the economics, but you have to talk to me about the technology. And we started to explore that together, and I just thought he was a beautiful and fascinating spirit. He was in the middle of writing his books, Manias, Panics, and Crashes. He was working on petrodollar recycling from the OPEC shocks to the emerging economies, and he and his sweet mate, Morris Edelman, who I thought at the time was the greatest oil economist in the world, I became their research assistant, helped them build conferences and, answer correspondence. I was just flowing in it. I just loved it.
I'm so incredibly jealous. Obviously, what difference does it make? It's not possible. I couldn't have possibly learned under Charles Kindleberger, but
I was a punk from Detroit at that time. I didn't have a resume.
Well, so was that before or after he had written his book on the Great Depression?
The World in Depression was already out because we read that as part of that first semester on.
So I was telling you, that's one of the few books that I've read twice and fully annotated, studied. I loved that book. I found it immensely valuable for thinking about so many of the change in commodity prices and everything else and how everything factored into everything else. What was your experience like reading that book and taking his class sort of educationally? What was that like?
Well, it felt like somebody just opened the blinds and you were starting to understand a part of the history that had been powerful in my family. A lot of my family had come from Germany in the 30s, and there was a lot of stories and folklore from aunts and uncles and everything else. And World War II was considered an outgrowth of dysfunction that started in World War I and went through the Great Depression. And here's a man who's talking about the changing of the guard from British leadership to American leadership. And one is relinquishing in stress before the others really picked up the ball. And in that void, in that dysfunction, is where a whole lot of turbulence and trouble for the world happened. And to me, right now, I can't think of two other books I would recommend to young people to read when they think about U.S.-China relations.
Really?
It's a different setup because the British and the Americans came from the same philosophical, religious, and historical tradition. That handoff should have been easier than one between the United States and China, or a collaboration and sharing. But Kindleberger also has this notion of the benevolent hegemon, that one country has to make ends meet and make the system balance. And we're moving to a multilateral, multipolar world, which is more unstable from the vision of Charles Kindleberger.
He also dealt a lot with currencies in that book, and of course there was an attempt to return to gold and the effect that it had on the UK with the attempt to return to the pre-war price. Fascinating book. And you also took classes under Thomas Ferguson too, is that correct?
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about Thomas Ferguson and what that was like and what you learned there, because I feel that his work expresses itself a great deal more. In fact, from the interviews I've seen of yours, I find you channeling his work even more. Oh,
it's been an enormous influence because, well, first of all, I'm fond of him, but the reason it's such an influence is because it was so ahead of the curve and it was so right about what was unfolding. I read his Ph.D. dissertation, which is not published. It's in the Seeley Mudd Library down at Princeton. It's 2,200 pages. It was called Critical Realignment, Decline of the House of Morgan and the Origins of the New Deal.
Wow.
And it was all about the power of industrial sectors and the transformation of the economy and the transformation of power within different subsectors of banks, or banks and investment banks, and all of these things. And his work was analytical, it was evidence-based, it was archival, and it was a human story. And let me go back a little before. When I first meet Tom, I said to him, my mother used to study a lot of things in economics, and I said, I'm listening to you talk about politics and the election of 1896 and the work of Walter Dean Burnham and all this stuff, but what do you know about banks and oil companies? And he says, do you like Chinese food? I said, yeah. He says, meet me tomorrow night at this restaurant in Central Square. So I get there, and there's two grocery bags of books, one on oil and one on banks, sitting on the table. And he was so generous, and he was so compromised by all of the rules and norms and fads of academia. I just felt like he cut right to the bone.
How is it that you had these amazing professors who were so willing and interested in being close to you as a student?
I don't know that.
What an incredible...
You'd have to ask them that, but I felt lucky to cross them, but I do... When I sense someone of that kind of brilliance, I do press them to see what I can learn. That's the part I contribute.
Was that when he came out, before you came to MIT, he came out with the investment theory of party competition? Is that correct?
He was working on it as a working paper. It was published in Jim Kurth's journal. I think it's called International Organization or Industrial Organization. I can't remember. I think it's International Organization. But I had read it as a working paper. It was an outgrowth of his thesis work. But all the things that were on his reading list make sense. And then a little bit later, when I was a graduate student, he did these two books, The Hidden Election with Joel Rogers, and also Right Turn, which is about how the Democratic Party is going to let go of its relationship to labor and broader social movements and work on what I'll call a defensive tactic to be able to raise the money in politics to not be squashed by the Republicans.
Was it Kevin Phillips who wrote The Emerging Republican Majority?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That came after that. And the work of Thomas Ferguson, his investment theory of party competition, was controversially accepted. It wasn't accepted at first.
It's controversial to this day because you have a whole bunch of people who are ideologists who are trying to whitewash what's actually happening in our system. And Tom just said, no, that's not what's happening.
What was his thesis for our audience?
His thesis was, to understand the machinations of politics, you have to understand the role of money. And in between, this isn't what might call a standard Marxian notion, which is they're just trying to crush labor. He thought what was interesting was that different sectors of the economy, the producers, oil, telecom, banks, where they have different needs. And it's the fight between them as studied through the money and who they give to and what structures and regulations and regulatory enforcement and cabinet nominations and everything flow from that money that designs or creates the imprint of what the society looks like.
So it's a complex system of competing interests working together that no mathematical model, you were also at MIT during the time of Paul Samuelson, that no mathematical model could capture. You were beginning to appreciate that, it sounds like.
You can create data which gives you the opportunity to see orders of magnitude, but every little nuance you can't capture.
Right. Okay.
Like who has a dime store in Iowa, I don't know about, but our banks, pharmaceutical companies, I'm using a present context, military production, are these people contributing a lot to what committees, to what people, for what purpose, at what time?
Exactly. Okay. And so was that the most influential factor in determining your choice to go to work in government after MIT?
No, I think there are a lot of different things. I was not inclined to become an academic. I felt like I was a little bit that guy in Detroit that, my baseball coach was mourning because he was a bodyguard for Walter Reuther who had been blown up in an airplane. And like I said, the 67 riots. And so I was interested in more institutional economics than I thought would be afforded to me as a
You wanted real-world
professor.
experience. Is that another way of saying it?
It's more like real-world learning. I felt like I knew how to do the math. I had an electrical engineering degree from MIT. I didn't think the math was a constraint or the statistics was a constraint to my, expression. But what I wanted to focus on differed from the agenda at, say, 1984, when I would have been an assistant professor. My dad was a doctor. I didn't want to do pre-med because it felt like a circus game. It didn't feel like learning about medicine. I thought, physician was a beautiful profession, but that had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. That obstacle course called pre-med had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. And the same thing came from being an assistant professor. I just thought I could live in a reality with economic knowledge, a little more a Kindleberger type spirit or an Edelman, the oil economist type spirit, than a guy who's doing models and
You wanted
all of
experiential knowledge.
Yeah.
Is that another way to
Yeah.
put it? So what was that transition? When did you move to government? I'm not entirely sure on what it is that you did. I know that you were...
Well, I left and I went to the Division of International Finance at Federal Reserve Board.
What year was this?
84.
84, okay.
And I worked there while I was finishing my dissertation. I had the good fortune to meet a man named Dale Henderson, Ken Rogoff, Peter Izard. These were committed civil servants with very high-level education.
Where was Rogoff at the time?
At the Fed.
At the Fed also.
At the Fed. Brilliant guy who was melding. I mean, you guys are grandmaster in chess, and he's melding that power of conceptual intellect with what's happening for real. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he wrote that book like This Time Is Different, meaning he was going to assimilate things and portray things with that sense of reality that was really under his skin.
And sense of history, clearly.
Yeah.
You must have met Paul Volcker as well.
Yes, I did. And as a matter of fact, I got engaged to a woman at the Fed, and
Really?
I told Ted Truman, who was my boss, and that we shouldn't work in the same place, and he got Volcker to get me seconded a year visiting with Pete Domenici in the Senate Budget Committee. And I ended up resigning from the Fed and staying at the Senate Budget Committee because I really liked Domenici and his staff, and that's where I really just broke into that. And Domenici was a fabulous mentor. I mean, he's still alive. I mean, but I'm just speaking of the
Pete
time.
Domenici.
Pete Domenici of New Mexico is the chairman of the United States Senate Budget Committee. His staff directors were Steve Bell, and there was Bill Hoagland after that. Gail Fossler was there. And Domenici said to me very early on, he says, I want to try to help you be helpful to me. He said, the first thing you got to do is when you do a study or you write a speech or anything, you got to come to me and you got to tell me who are the winners, who are the losers in the economy, Who are the winners and losers state by state? Who are my colleagues that I have to negotiate with and find a compromise? Who are the guys that are going to be on my team? So we were mapping from economic policy change into opposition and allegiance. Second thing he said to me.
Right back to Ferguson.
Yeah. Oh, Ferguson was a big help in my being able to diagnose and give reasonable advice. But then the next dimension into this was, he said, I don't always know what you're saying, but I'll let you write speeches. But the way you got to write a speech is you put your economics in. You turn the squawk box on every morning that you know I'm down on the floor, and you listen so I deliver things in my voice. I do not trip over words and craziness. You have to hear the music of my voice, write the speech with your ideas. That way I'll deliver it, and then I'll watch if James Baker, Paul Volcker, or whoever calls me, and I'll decide whether I'll use you again as a speechwriter.
Were you nervous?
Yeah. Oh, of course. But I thought the guy was giving me a roadmap to how to be helpful.
Wow.
And that was a great group.
How old were you at this point?
I was about 26.
Wow.
And
you were so young to be in that position.
No, it was
amazing.
It was really
wow.
You learn a lot for a few years in Capitol Hill. It is a really nice.
And when were you chief economist of the Senate Banking Committee?
That was right after that. 86, the Democrats took control because the Republicans had this pretend repeal of Social Security, where the Republican Senate came out for it, and then Ronald Reagan backed away, and the Democrats never had to stand up. And there was a lot of hostility. American Association of Retired Persons and others lobbied very hard, and the Democrats seized control. Proxmire was on that side. We had done some stuff between Domenici and Proxmire. In those days, things were quite bipartisan at times, about state-chartered, federally insured savings and loans, trying to stop wildness on the asset side of the balance sheet.
This is before the blow-up.
Before the blow-up, but it was coming. And so with the help of my friend Robert Drucker, who had worked with them, they hired me as the chief economist of the banking committee.
And you're like 29, if I'm doing the math right.
28,
wow.
29, yeah. And I had the traumatic birth experience that as I got there, we had the 87 stock market crash, and then the savings and loan bailout preparation.
Yeah.
So that seems like a minor league game compared to 2008, but the same kind of logic, the same kind of forces and everything were something you could learn about.
Absolutely incredible. So if you could summarize your sort of takeaways from that experience, what you learned that sort of stuck with you that it was most invaluable, was it, just to summarize, was it sort of the practical, experiential knowledge of what it was that you had already begun to learn at MIT about how the sausage is made, so to speak?
It's a combination of the conceptual frameworks and logic and seeing real-time experiences unfold before your eyes and integrating the two. Because when you just see a body of evidence, there's an old saying by E.H. Carr, the famous historian of the 20s and 30s, facts are like sacks. If you don't put anything in them, they don't stand up. And so the idea that you had an interpretive framework that you could try on, sometimes it can color your lens the wrong way, but sometimes it can help you integrate. What's all this chaos? Oh, I can see a sense of order here. But the evidence and the real-time episodes are driving your curiosity, your sense of priority, and I think that helped. I think as a postdoctorate education, that was a very good one for me.
So you're batting 1,000 right now so far. When did you leave your position in the Senate or in government, and was your immediate stop to Quantum Fund?
No. I had met George Soros briefly over the 87 stock market crash. I was reaching out to people like him and Warren Buffett, back channel, asking for evidence of what took place. And George had a particularly tense episode in the futures market where somebody had backed away and there was like an air pocket and he lost a lot more than he needed to and wondered if they hadn't been predatory vis-a-vis his position. But when Bill Proxmire retired, I decided to go to work in the private sector. I had 2 young children. Ronald Reagan had removed pensions for congressional employees, and I was thinking about their fortune. And my wife, of course, was taking maternity leave, and she was an economist at the Fed at the time too. And how would I say, just those pressures, those personal pressures, financial pressures. A guy named Mike Dooley was a first baseman on a softball team I managed, and he said, I saw this wonderful job at Bankers Trust Company, but my kids haven't finished high school and I can't take it yet, but can I put your name in? And I went up there and I fell in love with these guys. They were just radiant, vibrant, go-getter. They were led by a man named Jay Pomerantz, who was a fantastic spirit and speculator, an ordained rabbi, all this stuff. And they had a wonderful culture. So we moved to New York and I started that. And I thought, I got to get myself a little mentorship from this guy Soros. He's like, at the time, he's not like Madonna.
You're not bashful about
He's
asking
not
for help.
Madonna, though. I mean, he's not like the household name. He's this underground genius. And everybody that's in my little cohort at Bankers Trust knows of him and thinks he's super genius. And so because we had met before, he had actually invited me also to be on a transitional, while I was at Bankers Trust, a transitional thing about, it's called the Chatelain 500-day plan, about the transformation of Russia as the Soviet Union collapsed. And he asked me to write the segment on relationship between the parliament, like our
Congress.
This is
89?
Yeah.
89.
The parliament and the central bank. Because I used to run the Humphrey Hawkins hearings and the Fed governor confirmation and stuff in the Senate. So I could just kind of piece together what we did and our laws and help with that. But I wanted to get insight from Soros, and he very quickly, we had dinner with a guy named Richard Medley, who's now deceased, founder of Medley Global Advisors. And George and I started talking. He brought me over to meet Stanley Druckenmiller, who was his, the leading financial manager in his firm at the time.
You've called him the Michael Jordan of traders.
Absolutely.
Why?
Absolutely.
Well, I want to ask you later why that is, but continue. I didn't mean to interrupt.
So anyway, I started talking with them frequently. They were much broader based in their speculative strength. I was in a currency area, but I started working with another guy, a friend of Ken Rogoff's, named Norman Weinstein, who was a grandmaster in chess. And we built a foreign exchange fund that was involved in the ERM in Europe. The exchange rate mechanism was the system of bounding the currencies together, not in a tight fix, but in a 2.5%, 2.25% band on each side. And some were a little wider, like the Greece's and Portugal's. And
so you weren't officially with the fund yet as you guys started talking about ERM.
Okay. That happened later.
So you guys are talking about, so continue, you were talking about ERM.
Talking about ideas, talking about, what's happening in Australia. What do you think about Japan? I'd had a lot of experience, and my former wife was the head of Japan analysis for the Federal Reserve System. So I just was in the flow of strategic conversation with them.
Just for our audience, just a quick sort of consolidation recap. This is now, we're talking about the midst of dissolution of the Soviet Union, and ERM is the exchange rate mechanism that was put in place in Europe as part of the transition to the euro for countries that wanted to enter the euro and be part of the eurozone.
That's right.
And that has an important role to play in our conversation. So please continue. I just wanted to capture that and make sure.
Well, the next dimension is I was involved. The fund that Norman and I managed had a very large position in Finland, in the Finnish market. But more than just the ERM and German unification and the other stresses that took place, the collapse of Russia affected Finland disproportionately. Finland exported a lot to Russia, or to the Soviet Union. So we had to get out of a very big position and eventually took a short position in the Finnish market. Soros had friends in Finland. When the whole thing blew up in 1991 November, he called a guy named Pentti Kuri, who's now deceased. He was a MIT Ph.D. And Pentti, he said, "Who got this right?" And he said, "Well, that one guy from New York at Bankers Trust, Johnson, got on the right side of that."
Weren't you living in Finland for a while?
Didn't for just a couple months.
It's interesting. So our audience should also know my interview with Christian Mespia, which was episode 14 a few episodes ago. We discussed this. Christian wrote about your experience. He interviewed you extensively, I assume, for this.
Yeah.
And that was part of the conversation around qualitative versus quantitative modeling. And so you were in Finland learning, getting a feel of the place, and that was giving you a certain proprietary knowledge base from which to make a decision about the...
It's about timing. Because, for instance, a gentleman like Robert Solow, who was my teacher at MIT, or Paul Krugman, would have a modeling framework. And that would help me kind of see in the big picture, what do I think is going to happen? Then I'd got to go see what's going on institutionally in the place. And then when it's coming, like the heat is on in Finland, I moved my family to France because I wasn't having to ping pong every other day back across the ocean. And then I would go up and stay in a hotel room in Helsinki. I would go out to dinner with government officials, private officials. I would talk to reporters. And I was looking for something to break down in the relationships between the labor union and the government, which would trigger frustration and a need to devalue the currency.
Was there an intensity that you brought to that task? I mean, what was that particular experience like for you? I mean, I find that absolutely fascinating. I'm so jealous. But please, what was that like? I mean, how did you approach that task?
It was important to really listen, because if you could go out to dinner and you could listen to people with a hypothesis but not a conclusion in your mind. I wasn't saying, I know they're going to devalue. I'm thinking, it's very likely, but let's let them convince me. We go out to a nice restaurant, 3 or 4 of these guys, talking in indirect terms about models and simulations. And I remember going to a restaurant called Amadeus, named after Mozart one night, and these guys had a lot to drink. And I said, come on, guys, when you simulate a devaluation, you don't see a big run-up in inflation. You got 18% unemployment. And they all start saying, well, you're right about that in the simulations. And I said, they're doing simulations. They're getting ready. They're studying
what
devaluation.
What did that feel like, that moment? Was it a moment?
It's a poker moment. You just do not tell what you got in your hand.
Was it like adrenaline rush that you felt? I mean, do you still remember? That's amazing.
Yeah.
That is so incredible.
And well, when I went back, I had code words worked out with Norman.
Wow.
When it was time to get out. And so I went and I negotiated with the government a way to get out of that position without creating undue turbulence in the market. I asked him to make me a price right at the boundary, and I'd quietly get out. And I had a code word, something about, did the Minnesota Twins win last night? Or if I said, did they win last night, that meant get out. If I said, did they lose last night, that meant
what if you forgot?
I didn't
if you
forget.
mixed up your codes.
You can't forget at times like that. But
wow.
So there was an intense focus. There was a intense, this is kind of like a, Robert Ludlum story or something. And maybe when I talk about why I'm doing something different now, because it's not, what I want young people to understand is I didn't think it was a deep purpose. I thought I was learning, and I thought I was on a team and playing the best I could. But there were deeper parts of me that were not being fulfilled.
You felt like what you were doing
role.
Wasn't speaking to some higher purpose.
I was doing well, but I wasn't doing good in that.
But you weren't doing
sense.
it for the money. You were doing it for the learning and for the experience and for the adrenaline, for the game. Yes,
well, you and I talked earlier when Druckenmiller and I were talking one day. We were laughing about something, and he said, man, if Soros came in here and said, I'm only paying you $50,000 each, you'd still do the job. And I said, so would you? And he said, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, you guys were in a position to apply your knowledge and to learn from the market. I mean, the market offered you the most complex data set of sociological behavior of anything else I could imagine. So, all right, well, because I do want to get into what you're doing now.
Let me just say about that. You were talking about Druckenmiller and Michael Jordan. At the end of the first year when we'd worked together, I went to a party at his house, and I brought him a picture. My father was a jazz pianist. I was way into jazz music. And I brought him a picture of Miles Davis and John Coltrane playing together. And he was like, what's that? And I said, that's what it feels like to work with you.
Oh, wow.
Because there was I think John Coltrane's the finest musicians ever walked across this earth. And there was this feeling like Davis was his mentor and collaborator and made him better. And so through that image, that's what it meant to me, and that's why I gave him that picture.
It just feels very satisfying. I mean, it would be a very satisfying, viscerally satisfying experience. All right, so because I do want to get to some other things, let's just get to 1992. Did you join the Quantum Fund right after that, right after the experience in Finland?
No, it was in the following spring. There was a thing called the Maastricht vote in Denmark, and the Maastricht vote was no from Denmark. And then the French announced, we're going to vote, I think it was September 22nd.
They voted no on the Maastricht Treaty.
Right.
Which was German reunification.
And the French, the Maastricht Treaty was a bunch of rules related to the Eurozone in light of German unification. Right. And so the French announced on September 22nd, we will hold a similar vote. And I said, whoa, because the world doesn't start with no positions. Everybody's long all these high-yield things like Spain, Portugal, Italy, Sweden, and short Deutschmarks. And the system's under stress anyway. Germany is needing to do big fiscal expansion for
they're short Deutschmark because they're expecting that
that's a low-yield currency and the others are high-yield currencies.
Right.
And you earn, let's say Germany's yielding 8%, Sweden's yielding 12%.
Right.
Everybody's funded in Germany and making 400 basis points, 4 percentage points per
It's the
year.
carry trade. You're
just
talking
by
about
saying
they're all carry.
trade,
They're,
right.
they're borrowing in Deutschmark and
Correct.
and okay.
But the whole world's loaded up on that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So when the French say we're going to hold a vote, you think, what's going to happen on that day when they have that vote? Well, I don't want to be sticking around and find out with a big long position. So you go to day -1 or -10 or whatever, people are going to be unwinding positions. And that's going to put stress on everybody's reserves. The scale of the speculation was large in relation to the scale of reserves that the central banks and finance ministries in Europe held. And everybody was saying, well, the only way out of this is if Germany massively cuts rates. But they had a historic propensity to resist inflation for very sound reasons relating to what had happened there in the 20s and 30s. And so we said, this is a bottleneck that's not going to be resolved without devaluation. And I sat down with George and Stan.
But this is now hold on, because you mentioned the French, and we're talking now about the pound, because you guys
the pound comes into this because what's happening is the pound is a low yield currency,
right?
But it's fragile. It's a very interest sensitive currency. It's not going through a big fiscal stimulus like Germany, but it's very, very sensitive to floating rate mortgages, big equity market.
Right.
So Germany can ride out high rates a lot longer than
Let me get this
UK
straight,
can.
because I don't really know the history that well. You're expecting a reverse in the carry trade.
Yes,
Okay,
throughout the system.
Throughout the system, and because you're expecting that the Germans are going to have to start raising rates. The Bundesbank's going to have to raising rates.
Or won't cut them.
Or won't
to
cut
relieve
them.
The pressure
Or won't
on
cut
the
them.
others.
I'm missing the French vote. What was it that you were concerned about that the
If
French...
the French vote not to approve the Maastricht Treaty,
Got it, okay.
the ERM blows up.
Okay, got it.
And therefore, everybody's not going to wait for that result. They're going to square up their positions beforehand.
Yeah.
But the scale of positions was so monstrous that it was just going to unbuckle the whole system.
So you were worried about, even regardless of what the outcome of the vote would be, you were worried about the interim period.
I was worried about the fact that nobody would sit around and wait for the vote,
Right.
Because it wasn't obvious what the outcome would be, and that would motivate action in the months prior.
Money was going to pile into Germany.
Deutschmarks and out of the others.
Right.
And with the British being very fragile because of this high interest rate sensitivity of their economy and their financial markets, they looked quite vulnerable. And to put it the other way, to be long Germany and short the UK was only about 75 basis points, less than 1%.
And that's because of the ban on the ERM?
Well, the ban on the ERM and the British pound was a reserve currency and a very liquid currency. Had some of the same qualities that the Deutschmark had. I guess as the time approached, as September approached, we heard a speech where the Prime Minister, John Major, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, said that for the foreseeable future, the British pound will remain the reserve currency of Europe. And I was like putting a red flag in front of a German bull. And the Germans started to leak in their press and everything else. We're not cutting our rates for anybody. And seeing that vulnerability, working with one of our other colleagues who understood the equity markets in the UK, in other words, the balance sheets and income statements of the companies. His name is Scott Besant. He's now a very well-known financial manager. And Scott said, the British can't ride this out. So we sat down and we had a strategy to go after the...
So the Brits went in 1990, John Major, and that was mainly John Major really pushed that, right?
As the Chancellor of Exchequer, he went in. And then he became the Prime Minister succeeding
and
Thatcher.
he was banking his political career on that, and it wasn't a clearly popular position, right? I mean, there was a lot of opposition to that.
Well, there's kind of two camps in those days. There was what you might call the Eurocentric people. Michael Hazeltine was the head of that wing of the Conservative Party. And then there was the Anglo-centric, the United States and perhaps the Far East, Hong Kong were the other.
Well, hadn't the Queen said that I won't spend any money that doesn't have my face on it around that time?
Probably. I don't remember that. But
and there was a lot of pride, too. I mean, the Brits came in at a much higher valuation or relative value to the Deutschmark than Schlesinger and some of the people in Germany advised, correct?
Correct.
So they were already dealing with that. That was a problem
joined
right off the
at the
bat,
wrong
at
level.
the wrong level, and that's something that you could identify. You also
Yes.
take into account the politics. We're talking also about the carry trade, social mood. So, and that all sort of all those things kind of came together in a soup. And you guys were talking. So who were the major people in this sort of trade? It was you, George,
myself, George, Stanley Druckenmiller, Scott Besant, in some dimensions of it, and a consultant named David Smick, who lived in Washington, who I used to work with on Capitol Hill, who had very good relations with the German Bundesbank.
So when did you start putting on these trades, and when did you kind of go all in? Like, when was it?
Well, there was a position a couple months before, but we started really going for it after Major announced that they were going to be the reserve currency of Europe, and the Germans said, we're not cutting for anybody.
Wasn't George at that speech? Wasn't George Soros there?
I don't believe he was. I don't believe he was there.
Maybe it's folklore.
Because I think Dave Smick reported to us the German reaction, but I think George was with Stan and I in New York as that unfolded.
How significant was this also? I'm curious, because a lot of people don't recognize the importance of what I often find with my friends is they have this expectation that there is this, George talks about this reality and perception and reflexivity and when these things get out of whack. How significant was this? You guys alone would not have been able to break the bank. You wouldn't have been able to stare down the Bank of England. They had $44 billion in foreign exchange reserves. But
it was less.
Was it less
22 billion pounds was what I recall.
Okay.
And we were.
I meant dollars, but.
Oh yeah, then you're not far off.
Yeah.
The dollar to pound was about 2 to 1. You're right.
Yeah. But you relied on the perception in the market that they wouldn't be able to hold that line, and so you needed that to be part of your whole analysis.
There's different things that are happening there. One, the sheer volume of what we're doing. I mean, we had a target of going for 15 billion pounds.
You were super leveraged.
So we would be super leveraged. We'd be about 4 to 5 to 1 as a firm.
You would have blown up if you were
a one-sided
maybe.
bet. We would take more than half of their reserves if we had gotten all of our position on. We didn't. Second thing is all the dealers that are working with us, they're saying, this Soros guy's smart. Druckenmiller's smart, man. Let's go for it. People like my alma mater at Bankers Trust are saying, we're hearing you're doing this. Various guys that have been in my network and Stan's network and everybody are calling from all over the world saying, you guys are going for it. Now, we don't give them, come on with us. We don't do that stuff. We just say, there's an opportunity here that the world is getting excited about. We keep a modest and secretive perspective. At the time, my wife was a New York Fed official, and she knew nothing of what I was doing until several days after.
That's the game. I mean, that's the game. You guys were in it. That was an incredible experience. I mean, that's...
How would I say? To me, if you say in a kind of a pinnacle moment, Stanley Druckenmiller, I said I would have today called him the Roger Federer of financial speculation. In those days, it was Michael Jordan. But he was so brilliant and so intense and so clear-minded. And George is this kind of like god of that realm. Like he's really a genius, I mean, like no question about it. And I'm working with him as a coach, and he's not threatening to take away our banking license or any of these other kind of things. Like if you're working at Bankers Trust and you blow things up in Europe, they might get mad and ban your bank, and then your stockholders and your top management are upset. George wanted to go for it.
Yeah.
George has courage. He has insight. He's a coach, but he's a tremendous player coach. And
show up in the moment.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
So to me, what I call the freedom to just go after these ideas, which I had been living in the bowels of this ERM system, and they would have done it without me. I hope they believe, and I think they believe, that my presence helped them do bigger and faster and more decisive because of the intimate experience I brought from all my running around in Europe. But they taught me one hell of a lot. And Scott, with his knowledge of the interest burdens of the British companies, and Smick's knowledge of German central banks, it took a lot of things to create that level of intensity and aggression and decisiveness.
You're remarkable. I hope you write about this one day in great detail.
Yeah, Sebastian Mallaby wrote a nice book called More Money Than God. And
I'm familiar. He was on the show, actually. Yeah. Sebastian was on the show. Yeah.
He's got a new book on Alan Greenspan.
That's what the show was all about, actually. Yeah. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. It was a total geek out, central bank geek out. Okay, and you guys made a lot of money. You guys made somewhere between $1 and $2 billion on that trade, right? Somewhere there. I mean, a lot of money. It was a huge payday. So after that, we don't have to go into sort of what you did after that, because I do want to get into what you're doing now. Now, you are the president of INET today?
Yes.
Okay, so why don't you tell us a little bit about what INET is?
INET is called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and it was founded in 2009 after conversations between the journalist Anatol Koletsky, George Soros, myself, and Robert Duggar, where we all felt that the TARP legislation that came down after the Lehman crisis unfolded was going to be toxic, that we were not just going to have a crisis of finance, we were going to have a crisis of government legitimacy. This beginning with this, what do you call it, page-and-a-half bill that was put forward by the Secretary Paulson, and then the structure of that legislation, and then the feeling you're going to have bailouts with no penalties, no prosecution, and reform to follow, but after the pressure's off and given the strength of financial lobbies, which I was quite familiar with from working on the banking committee, that this would be a despondency would emerge in the body politic in America. And we saw it in Occupy, we saw it in the Tea Party. It's not a left or right thing. But the other dimension was you had a society where financiers were considered the highest paid, the best and the brightest, the wise men, the prescient, the disciplined. So they could tell you can't have money for your school system or for your health care system. We can't afford it. And then they walk up to the bar, snap their fingers and say, give me $800 billion now, fast. We need it. We messed up. That scares people to the roots of the legitimacy of a society. INET was formed, which you might call fill the void, related to the loss of confidence in efficient markets and rational expectations and all of these prevailing free market ideologies, without necessarily submitting to a naive romance about how government would fix it, because government is a more complicated process.
I had been reading some great writers prior to the crisis, and so I was tuned into the mortgage market. I was tuned into the dangers and sort of the meltdown that was inevitable. And so when the Fed stepped in the way that it did, Paulson, the bailout, everything, that shocked me. But of course, I was looking at it as a young man with no experience in that world. You were a person who has sort of been in the world of high finance. Were you equally shocked? I've seen interviews from that time of yours. I saw also, by the way, an interview you did with Bill Moyers, whose show I miss. I really wish he was still around doing that show. And you seemed, I think, in the early days, optimistic about what we could accomplish, what the Obama administration could accomplish, given his rhetoric. Were you shocked at the initial effect, sort of, with what Bush did in the bailouts and Paulson, and then subsequently the lack of enforcement and lack of follow-through by the Obama administration?
Shocked would be the wrong word for the first portion, which is the TARP, because I was involved in the process and I knew the political economy of the Bush administration and the power of finance and how things had been going. So to think that somehow the Congress was going to turn on a dime when various high-level Democratic officials were telling me after Bear Stearns, when I'd do a PowerPoint in their office, they'd say, well, we got to do 5 fundraisers a week on Wall Street. We'll deal with that after the election.
You're talking about March 2008. You're beginning to pick it, right?
Yeah, right before, several months before Lehman, I'm saying this isn't over. This is the kind of the first shoe to drop, and you guys got to watch out. And I'm talking to Democrats, talking to Republicans, and everybody's afraid to shut off the faucet on financing for elections and discipline the financial sector. So I wasn't shocked at all by the tepid response.
Because they were also compromised in terms of the amount of money they were taking from finance.
That's right. And cognitively, they thought these were the experts. These were the leaders. These were the vanguard of discipline, creativity.
It's an intimidating subject for many people.
Yeah.
I've found that people are more intimidated by finance than any other subject I've covered on the show. People in Silicon Valley who are brilliant, I've often encountered them to be sort of intimidated by the subject, which is
finance almost mystical.
Yeah.
That's why Bill Grider wrote that old book, Secrets of the Temple, about the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. I like that book.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that book. You like that book too?
You see my name all over the acknowledgments because he's a close friend. So if
I
said I didn't enjoy that book, I'd be a liar.
I have to tell you, I loved that book. And in fact, that book, and this is a little interjection here, but when we were speaking about economics and such, that was one of the most important books in helping me understand the most basic aspects of how interest rates, how the Fed set interest rates, and the way monetary policy operated. And this was after I had gotten a bachelor's degree in economics. We never learned anything about interest rates.
Yes.
That was, the Saturday Night Special and all that stuff. We kind of covered that with Sebastian as well. But I did very much enjoy that book. But I cut you off there.
No, we're just saying I wasn't shocked by what happened with TARP. Where I was hopeful with the intensity of that crisis and with Obama's wonderful communicating skills and the turnout of young people, I had hoped he would be more bold. And if you recall, when I was on with Bill Moyers, I was arguing that they needed to basically create a sacrificial lamb. In my thinking at the time, nationalize and break up Citibank. Because if they had done that, it would have differentiated Obama from his predecessor, Bush. It would have said, we've turned a page, it's new, it would have bought time, and it would have created a sense of leadership that this guy really stood up. He practiced what he had preached.
And to be clear, nationalizing the banks didn't mean actually putting in bureaucrats in positions of management. It simply meant that transfer the equity over to the government, who was bailing out these institutions, dismantling them because you needed them, given the fact that they're such an integral part of the way that credit flows.
That's right. They would continue to operate in a receivership, in a structure, and then be sold back to the private sector. I used to joust a little bit with some of the members of the Obama economics group in the administration. I'd say, guys, you've already socialized the downside. We're just fighting over the upside.
And I think the answer is pretty clear, but what happened and why? Why did that follow through not happen?
I think there are two dimensions to it. One, which is there's a pattern of intertwined holdings all around the world, and people were afraid to do anything that would propagate anxiety, unfamiliarity into a system that was already traumatized and fragile. The second is Obama knew he needed to get reelected. And if you looked at his 2008 war chest, it's real clear how big finance was. And the question is, how are you going to fill that hole in 2012? And that's not personal about Obama. That's the logic of our system and two parties and everybody running for Congress. And so I think if he had, they said at the time, with Obama's great oratory skills, he could take one of two tracks. He could mobilize the people to reform the political economic system profoundly, or he could use his skills to mollify the people on behalf of the elites. And most people think he took the latter course. But we're not just talking about, playing Parcheesi or something. We're talking about trillions of dollars, and he's a young man, not a lot of experience in finance personally.
Exactly.
I don't know where you find the spine to do that. So I can only be so critical.
Sure, of course.
Because if you're sitting in the captain's chair, that's a big, big decision.
Sure. And you want to talk about power. And then there's so many sources and centers of power all around you. Yeah, I think that's important for people to appreciate that. It's just one person and it's just one office. And the government includes many people, many sources of power, conventions, etc. So then, you know what? That brings us to something which you talk about often, because there are a number of things that I wanted to get to, but one of them is money in politics. I've watched a bunch of your interviews. That is a theme that constantly crops up. Here we have another great example of how money in politics corrupts the system. It makes it so that it's non-representative of the sort of communal societal issues that we face. And people keep saying we've got to get the money out of politics. Bernie Sanders ran on that platform, that we have to get the money out of politics. How do you get the money out of politics when politics is so influenced by money already?
The dilemma is enormous, because in order to enact a law and pass a law which gets money out of politics, incumbents who are in office now have to vote for it. But money in politics is an insurance policy for incumbents, because if everybody has to raise money, incumbents can sell existing policy to lobbyists, corporations, wealthy individuals. Challengers can only sell something contingent on winning. So they can cotton up to the ideology of what they think the big deep pockets want, but they don't really have the power to sell anything until they're in office. So incumbents giving up money in politics by enacting a law of campaign finance reform has to come from a place. People are talking about how John McCain, with the McCain-Feingold Act, felt so embarrassed by the Keating 5 episode of the Saving Loan that he was trying to, with dignity, do something that would clean things up. He was redeeming himself.
Right, exactly.
But the whole system right now is, I think, very dangerous. There's a paper by Ben Page and Martin Gillens which talks about how when you break surveys between the top 10% and the bottom 90, almost everything that Congress does is pay attention to the top 10% and not the bottom 90 when they differ. I mean, almost exclusively. And then you look at, why is Donald Trump in office? When you talk about the politics and economics of despair, symptoms of healthcare problems, places where houses stayed in a slump, these are the same districts that voted for Trump. So that the failure of a broad-based prosperity, which is in part the byproduct of a contorted money politics system, produces the rebellious reaction and bring someone like Donald Trump to power.
And, that also dovetails with the need for new economic thinking, because the trade policies are very much based on this sort of Ricardian model of comparative advantage.
Yes.
And in general, there has been a bias in the academic community towards many of the neoliberal policies that divorce economics from politics.
Yes, and you can't do that.
Can't do that.
And the way, there's a sleight of hand here. Economists say you should do free trade, according to the Ricardian type logic, because everyone can be better off and no one worse off, because there are gains from trade. But the redistribution of those gains so that everyone is better off never happens. I've said this to many leading economists who are trade economists in recent years. I started on Capitol Hill in May of 1984. I would put $1,000 on the table at breakfast every morning and say, in the next 365 days, I bet there will be no major trade adjustment assistance bill passed. You put $1,000 on the other side and we have a bet. No one would have taken that bet between then and now. And this is 2017.
Willful ignorance.
What's that?
Willful ignorance on the part of policymakers.
Yeah. And then you get into something which you and I have talked about offline a bit, they call the ideas industry.
Oh, I love what you sent me there.
When you get tenure, when you get big chairs, when you get appointments at think tanks, when you get prestigious sabbaticals, you get government positions, you get consulting contracts, there's a whole big price to pay for having integrity and being honest and going with the flow, which is, why not do free trade? Everybody can be better off and no one worse off, except you left out the political adjustment that isn't going to happen. Where does that willful ignorance come from? It may not just come from, being asleep at the switch. It may come from, what is it Upton Sinclair said? Sometimes people depend on not understanding in order to keep their paycheck going how it is.
Absolutely, 100%.
There is a cognitive dissonance that takes hold, and you can't say that experts in a highly wealth and income concentrated society are going to be immune from the consequences for themselves. I always tease economists. I say, you guys model everybody as venal and greedy, and you model yourself as dispassionate scientists. If you endogenize yourself and became venal and greedy, you would understand how come economics doesn't map what we need to see.
That is 100% correct. I had a show before this one that I did many years ago. I created a television show called Capital Account. It had a particular perspective, and it became impossible for me to divorce myself from that perspective because I had straitjacketed in. And I think it's very difficult in our society today to evolve and organically because people sort of attach to your ideas and they attach to you. And even if it were, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think there's so much truth to that. It's Dresner is the name of the individual.
David Dresner.
David Dresner. I need to get him on this show. I watched the video. I'm going to get his book. I really liked the thesis. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more broadly about income inequality, because that's something else that you guys discuss, and that's something I'm very interested in, particularly from the standpoint of how it manifests in society. We see it with, you and I spoke a little bit about Uber. We did a market forces short segment on Uber with an analyst where we discussed their business model and their valuation. And to me, Uber reflects something that I've seen across the board, which is the fact that you have now an extraordinary level of wealth represented by capital, or by wealth, individuals with money who are looking for places to put that money. And they're taking these sort of moonshots because it makes sense economically from their standpoint. And they're also buying, I have this anecdote to say as well. I was in the Hamptons recently at a very small party. I didn't know anyone there. It wasn't even a party. It was like 6 people at a small little pool on a 40-acre estate with horses running across the grass. The house had been sold 3 years ago, brand new, no furniture still. No one had ever lived in the home except for the staff. And the people that were there were not even the people living there. They were just staying there because the person who owned it let them stay for a little while. I mean, that is happening across the board in real estate, in Shanghai, Australia, New York.
You have emerging markets where they don't think the currency's stable, so they buy New York and London real estate
100%.
as a store of value.
100%.
It's a new currency.
100%. Art, everything. And, of course, Uber's valuation of almost $70 billion, I think, reflects that. They've been spending reportedly billions of dollars subsidizing their riders, with the hope that they might have a successful exit. I mean, that to me reflects a broken capitalist system as a result of the inequality. So I'd love to talk to you about that. What do you think of that, of what's going on with wealth inequality and disparity and how that's maligning the capitalist system, making it incompatible? And to me, it feels very feudalistic, rent-seeking.
Well, the ability to use wealth to protect yourself from misfortune with government bailouts and things like that, or to enact policies like cut my taxes and cut the public school systems of all the people in rural America so that the budget balance is the same, but I'm better off and they're all worse off. Those are the byproducts of highly concentrated wealth, what we might call a plutocratic feudalism. And that is a dangerous and unstable, socially unsustainable system unless people deploy weapons and ordnance at a scale that's very inhuman. And so I think we also see tremendous psychological damage. I would encourage your listeners to watch Mark Levin's HBO. There's a film called Class Divide. It's about education in New York City, where there's a private school right across the street from the projects, and the damage that's done to the children in the wealthy private school. Psychologically, maybe even greater than that's done to those on the outside in the projects who know the system's unfair. Because the ones on the inside know it's unfair, but they don't know how to handle what you might call the existential guilt of why they're there. Are they there because mom or dad or grandma
Like
or somebody has
guilt.
a lot of money, not because they have any merit? Makes them even more psychologically vulnerable and insecure.
Well, having a lot of money also makes you like a prisoner. I mean, you sort of you become very fear-based. If you inherit or you have a great deal of money, you're constantly worried about losing it, and that's reflected.
That's where shame can be. Losing a lot of money once you have it. That's how you can be shamed. Yeah.
And there's a lot of, again, I'm familiar with this because a lot of the sort of stuff I cover comes from the perspective of looking at where can you sort of find safe assets, where can you invest in this period of time, and I think that's reflected in that. What do you think about technology and the role of technology today, and how does that factor into the work that you guys are doing at INET?
I think that advances in technology on the positive side raise the scope or possibility for the betterment of mankind, but they are not just good. There's good and evil contained within. The social structure of transitions, how you manage them, what kind of technologies you subsidize, to what ends and what goals, are human collective social policies. The fact that you have an Uber, that might be a good thing, but if you can see some side effects, the fact that you don't have a society that's powerful enough to mitigate those side effects and channel it in a constructive direction is a failure. And I think right now we're coming out of a period I'll call the post-Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan era, where the idea that the market is a deity that solves everything and doesn't require the input of morals and ethics and values or a vision of what a good and healthy society is, and a highly unequal society is not, in my view, a vision of a healthy society. How do you mitigate those things? How do you design systems to garner the benefits of that innovation and channel it in ways that are socially meaningful and productive? And we're not facing that challenge. We're pretending that you can't talk about values because that's what happened in the old days where you had to separate church and state. Or you're saying you can't talk about the state because we watched what happened in Soviet Russia. These are all like little cartoon parodies of what needs to be done. We need to talk about values. We need to talk about design, and we need to talk about collective action, as I say, to channel these innovations in a way that helps everybody. And some of your most far-sighted and interesting people in Silicon Valley, I'll recommend a kind of a guy who collects that wisdom is Tim O'Reilly, who's got a new book coming out in October called What's the Future? There are people out there who care. There are also people out there who want to just get everything the hell out of their way so they can make some more money. I didn't know myself if basic guaranteed income as a hypothesis came from guys who just want to get people out of the way of their new apps and innovation, or if they came from a genuine care for humankind. Probably a little of both, because you can recognize when you're on an unsustainable trajectory People are going to stop your innovation.
But I think you'll agree that's not the ideal path. You want something, because people don't want to sit around. People weren't created to just have an income. They want a meaningful life. I just want to emphasize something else in what you're describing about market ideology. I think people need to recognize corporations are not a natural phenomenon, and economic externalities are called economic externalities exactly because they aren't represented in the capitalist system. And so those are two fundamental disconnects, and I think it's important for people to recognize that if you're saying that markets are not perfect because they can't be perfect because they don't internalize everything, and also the way we've constructed them with corporations, an example, they don't function like a laissez-faire, pioneer economy in 1776.
Right.
So, that's an important point.
Well, it's like your man Denzinger talked about the thought leaders. They're like visionaries of something that's really simple and big and bold, and whatever, the wealthy or powerful affirm it. Someone who he calls on the other side a public intellectual has a more nuanced yin and yang, this and that. People, it doesn't inspire their enthusiasm. It doesn't inspire patrons. It may be right, though.
That's why we need to address the problem of poor continuing education. I don't mean in schools. I mean, the way people are educated today through the news or Facebook, everything else is inadequate. And, we don't even need to get into all the stuff of why that is. It's stuff that I've tried to talk about on the show before, but that's a huge problem. The fact that people can't wrap their heads around these sorts of things because of the way that everything is talked about in sound bites, and people want easy, lazy explanations for everything. Well, let me ask you, there are a few things I want to run through now if we have the time. So we talked about technology, we talked about some of these other issues. I think a really huge one is secular stagnation. And I think of that with respect to, on the one hand, debt that the income producers are carrying more than anything the previous generations faced. And then on the other hand, we have the structural demographics issue on the other side of that, which is people going into retirement, needing to begin to consume and need to pull their investments out of the stock market, not being able to work. And so those are two incongruencies that have to work together. That is a huge problem. I think that we don't really appreciate, I think in the same way that we can't appreciate climate change. It's nonlinear. What is your view on that?
Well, we're doing a big project. Adair Turner, my chairman of the board, who ran the Financial Services Administration in Britain, Larry Summers, who you know from Harvard University, and myself at INET are doing a big project on the different elements of secular stagnation. One, as you articulated, a large subset of, which is what are the causes? Are these debt overhangs? Does inequality also drive debt accumulation among the more despairing and then lock them up so they don't feature prominently in demand? We have secular stagnation, say, in Japan, where the population's aging, but you don't have it in Southern Africa or India. It's just they don't have any money to be that demand. So the inequality plays a role. Technological pessimism plays a role. Adair Turner often emphasizes that a lot of the investment today, like WhatsApp, 51 employees and $19 billion, they didn't have to go out and build machines.
Yeah, the zero marginal cost
so
factor.
The savings is there, and the investment is small relative to the impact that's created, meaning financial investment, the input to get that output when you're successful. So there's a lot of questions now about how is the macro system balancing savings investment. There's a lot of questions related to inequality. There's questions related to, do debt overhangs create a problem? Martin Guzman, who's a young man at Columbia University, do we not have sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms where, just like a corporate debt, you can reschedule and move on? We sit here and slog and slog and slog like the Greek government in Europe, basically, so you never have to have a write-down by the German or the French or the other big banks.
That's a huge problem.
And these things contribute to that stagnation. So I think there are a lot of dimensions. And then the final one is what I'll call the game of musical chairs. In a stagnant world, everybody tries to depreciate their currency to generate some more export-led growth. But that is a zero-sum game. That's pushing the stagnation onto somebody else's shores. Wow. I know you've had James Rickards and others on you, Mark Faber and others. They're quite aware of these inconsistencies in the operation of the current dysfunctional system.
Speaking of Europe, that is sort of in some ways, I wouldn't say forgotten, but certainly unappreciated, I think, or it was in the news in 2011, but it's no longer really in the news there. What do you think is the future of the euro and some of these economies in Europe that are under a great deal of stress, like Greece?
I feel that there has been a great deal of destruction of young people throughout Europe. With the levels of youth unemployment, the lack of investment in young people in the future generation, I think is a tremendous tragedy. The second dimension is the scale of the migration inflow from North Africa and the Middle East. We're talking about Syria a lot right now, is overpowering. People tell me in a 250 million person society, Europe as a whole, they're talking about over 12 to 15 years, maybe 60 million new people. How do you take a place where you have youth unemployment, lots of young men with no jobs, and then you bring all kinds of new people in? That demands a level of politics and compassion and guidance and insight and wisdom that isn't a free market phenomenon. And whether they can do that, I think Europe is a very dangerous place, not meaning dangerous for you physically,
Right.
but vulnerable
Sure.
to disintegration and dysfunction in much more than people realize.
I'm getting the cane here, Mr. Johnson. I'm getting the flashing red lights. I'm going to have to end this interview. I wish we could keep going on and on. Maybe one day I could get you back on and we could continue where we left off, because there's so many things that I want to speak to you about. You're so knowledgeable. I've never met anyone that's read as much as you and experienced as much as you. Those two things are not common. Usually, you spend your whole life in academia and you read the books, or you're in the trenches, but you don't have time to integrate those two. So it's been a great pleasure having you on. I hope our audience really appreciates it.
Well, I
think they will.
How would I say? I just want to keep working for my 4 children. So I read and I work, I experience, and I don't sleep that much because of them.
All right. Well, thank you again, Mr. Johnson. Thank you so much. And that was my episode with Robert Johnson. I want to thank Dr. Johnson for being on my program. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforcespod.com. Join the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforcespod.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.